Today we're changing the carrier out of Dana44 front, and this is 1976 Dodge half ton. The front differential was taken out of a 1986 Ram Charger for the locking hubs. So maybe know what you're working with before you start, and so you get all the right parts and everything. And once you've done that, we're gonna start off by loosening all the bolts off the cover. And you can leave a couple on the top, loosen them off, remove the bottom ones, put in a punch or a chisel or a screwdriver, pry open the bottom and drain all of your oil into a container. I've got on here I welded a nut on there to accept the plug, and you can drain that out. There's also still going to be some residual oil in there after you've drained it out from the plug and pulled the cap off, and that's going to access the inside of the differential. On the driver's side, there's going to be a C-clip that needs to be removed so that you can pull the axle shaft out of the carrier that way. There is no C-clip on this one to remove the axle shaft on the passenger side, but after we've done this, then we have to go to the either side of the wheels to prepare to pull the axle shafts. First thing you're going to want to do is you're going to jack up the vehicle and put your stands on there. Remove your tires, and then we want to get rid of our brake caliper, so that you'll be removing these two keepers here on the brake caliper bracket, and that is going to allow you to move the caliper off of the rotor. Next, to remove the rotor, we want to remove our locking hub here. So we'll remove all these bolts, and then you'll pull that off of there. And inside there's going to be a snap ring, and that snap ring is going to be fastened onto the axle shaft here, so you'll remove that. And inside the hub itself is going to be this locking ring here. You remove that locking ring, then you should be able to get the locking hub out. When the locking hub's activated, it's going to engage the splines off of the axle into the splines into the hub. That's just going to drive your rotor. Next, after you've got that removed, you're going to see the spindle here inside there, and then you've got a series of lock nuts. So you'll have your first lock nut. That's going to be down, and that's going to be contacting the bearing there, and that's the one that you snug it up and then back it off to get your preload. Once you've achieved that, then there's a little pin on here, and you would put your locking ring on there with the slot lined up, and then on that you end up putting your other lock nut, and this is the one you're going to drive tight. So as you see it in there, you're going to remove this one, and you're going to pull this one out, and then this one should basically only be finger tight. That should come out pretty easy. So you'll remove those series of lock nuts, and now you should be able to pull off your rotor. So once you got the rotor off, the spindle is going to be left, and splash shield behind it. You'll remove all these bolts here and these nuts. You'll remove all those, and then you can take out the spindle, and you can take off the splash shield here. And then now you have your axle shaft, but this knuckle isn't going to want to come out until you remove your caliper bracket, because this is going to be in the way and it's not going to allow the axle shaft to come out. Once you get the cover off, you're going to want to remove your two caps here so you can remove your carrier. I don't know if you can see, but it's stamped here and here on both sides so that you can put the caps on back in their proper orientation. Down underneath the truck here, you grab a big pipe wrench, you put it on the yoke, and then you've got your long bar with your socket to remove the nut so that you can remove the yoke, and then you can remove your pinion out of the differential housing here. I got 1/1/8 is the socket that fit this one here. Some guys, what they'll have is they'll have a plate made that can bolt on here, and it'll have a hole so you can get your socket in there. And I don't have that. I've made do with a big pipe wrench every time I've done this job. So I think some of the other vehicles, if you don't have a yoke like this where it's round, you might have to build one of them plates to hold that while you're loosening off the nut. Once you get the nut off there, you're probably gonna have to tap this with a hammer. Try and hold it this way and keep it held there, because when you're hammering this off, it's the bearings contacting the cones inside. You don't want to damage those, so you try and keep the pressure towards you as you're tapping this off. And then once you get that off, you pull the yoke off of there. Then you're going to remove the pinion out the other end. So you might have to tap on the other side, tap the other end, just get this started, and then you can pull the pinion out from this side. And when you're tapping it, you're tapping the pinion shaft off of the inside bore of the bearing in there. That's what's going to be snug, kind of holding it. So you tap that out, and then you pull it out from this side, and then you'll be removing these cups when you put your new bearings in. You'll be removing these cups and that cup and cone in the back there from the other end. That cone will come out from the other end, and then you get a drift in from this side to drive the cup out that way, and then you'll go on the other end and you'll get a drift, and you're gonna try and grab the inside of this cone, and you're gonna drive it this way. Once you got the carrier removed, depending on what you're doing, if you're using the same carrier and gear set, or if you're changing your gear set, you're going to get a new ring and pinion. And if you're doing that, you're going to want to stone the back side of the ring gear and the flange, and that's just going to take off any high spots, make sure everything is smooth, so when you put the ring gear on, then there's no interferences. It's going to be straight and true. And you're going to want to use some red Loctite on the bolts there. Sometimes what you need to do is you need to heat the gear up so that it'll fit. There's a little bit of an interference fit here, and sometimes you can just bolt it on, just going across from each other to get it down seated to the flange. And then once you've achieved that, then you can probably go around and around, torquing it down to spec, whatever the spec is for your application. if you are changing the carrier, you're going to want to get the proper one. So you want to measure from the bottom of the carrier to this flange here, so that you have the proper carrier. And also too, you're going to want to make sure that it's going to have the correct splines to accept the axle. So you want to make sure that those two are correct. And if you're doing neither, you're just replacing the bearings on your original carrier, then you remove the bearings and replace them. If you're changing the carrier, you're going to have to remove all of your bearings, and you're going to have to get all of the shims. There's going to be shims behind these bearings here on the carrier on both sides. I have that bottom one removed over here, and there's a set of shims that are in behind there. There's also a set of shims behind this one here. And so you'll remove your bearings, and you'll calculate what your shims are for the original application. On your pinion here, there's going to be a set of shims behind this bearing, and there's also a set of shims behind the cup of this bearing here. So you remove all your bearings and write down what shims you have in what locations. And when you're removing the bearings, depending on what you have available to you, when I started out I didn't have anything but a grinder, so I used a grinder and I cut off the cage and the rollers here, and I got down to the inner race, and then I would get something to set it on, and then I would heat up that inner race, and then hopefully it would fall off. If not, then you pull out the grinder again, and you're going to cut again on a diagonal. Try not to get through the inner race, just get really close, and then open it up, spread it up with a chisel. And then, you know, there's an expensive puller out there, but I don't have that. So what I did was I built these plates here, and I got 2 plates, and then I used some key stock, and the plates bolt to the key stock, and then I welded some nuts on here, and we've got another piece of key stock. These are the puller rods, this is the pusher. So you torque this down, you'll have a piece of metal in here to push against. It's got to be smaller than the inside diameter of the bearing, and then that's gonna pull your bearing off of there. I couldn't use this clamshell style puller because it's too thick. It's too thick in there, and it's not contacting enough. And there's no room underneath it here. You're pulling off of the cage, and you can't get to the inner race of the bearing. So my puller worked, but when I had to remove the bearings a second time to adjust my shimming, then I damaged the bearing, and it was obvious. It was pulling off of the cage here, and it damaged that, and it doesn't even rest properly into the cup. This one here looks good. I mean, if you look at it, it looks like it's still good, but it is damaged too, because when you turn it, there is some catchy spots in there. so it was damaged as well. So what I ended up doing was I removed all the old bearings that were still good, and I ground out the inside bore so that they can be installed and removed by hand. And the reason I did that is so that when you're adjusting your shims, you can pull the bearings off, adjust your shims, install it, check it, and I had to do that about 5 times. So maybe that'll help somebody out there if you're doing the same thing. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to do your pinion for your installation and your shims, and you start off with your original shims, whatever they are, and if there is any, and those go in behind the cone on this bearing here. And what's that's gonna do is that's adjusting the depth of the pinion into the ring gear. There's also these shims as well, and they correspond with each other, whereas you subtract from one side, you add to another to equal it out. And later on, once you've established that, these shims back here, you might have to adjust them one more time, because those shims are going to go on the pinion, and then you're going to have your bearing, and then you have your yoke, which is going to be torqued up against the bearing here. And you want to have there's got to be a preload on the bearing, right? So if you can't achieve that preload, you might have to adjust these shims again to be able to get your preload. If there's too many shims, you might not be able to get that preload, so you might have to take some shims out of there. So the first thing is you want to adjust your pinion depth into the ring gear, and then you're going to adjust your preload, your shims here for your preload for the pinion, and now that completes the installation of the pinion. Well, now when you're doing your engagement into the ring gear, you're going to be using some compound on the ring gear teeth here, and you install it, and then you turn it around and put some load on there so that the teeth will rub a wear pattern in there so you can see, and then there'll be instructions to show you what you need to do to adjust that and get a good wear pattern in there. So usually what you want is you want a good contact, basically center of the tooth. You don't want it to either end, and you don't want it on either end here, the end of the tooth at the top, or if it's in too deep and it's contacting the root. So you'll be adjusting those shims to achieve that. Once you've got your depth, once you've got your preload, now you're going to be doing your backlash. And your backlash is going to be on this carrier here. And so the same thing is that you got the shims in behind this bearing, and you've got the shims in behind this bearing. And what you're doing, you've already got your contact, so now you're adjusting these shims to get your backlash. Same thing as if you're subtracting from one side, you're adding to the other to equal it all out. And you know, I had to do this 5 times before I got it. And so you're pulling them bearings off, you're adjusting them shim packs, and until you get the right reading. Don't know if you can see that very well, but that's my wear pattern on my ring gear when it was all said and done. And lastly, you're gonna wanna turn the gear and just make sure it's nice and smooth and you don't have any trouble. That's where I found that the one bearing, even though it looked good, there's a sticky spot, and that's why I pulled it back out and I replaced that bearing. Also too, once you've established your backlash and your preload on all your bearings, they're recommending that you take it for a light drive, and then you're going to take temperature readings to see if this thing's overheating or not, right? And just a good check, just to see if things are too tight, you got too much preload on your bearings or something like that. It's just a good check.